thanks for your patience. In a sense, this kind of problem of logging into the computer, who's logged in, how much memory of the computer is being used by other users that are logged in yet not present, in a sense, is maybe a good kind of case study for what we're looking at. So, in this section, we're continuing the cases, so looking at how digital media changes existing forms. And in the second batch of case studies, we'll look at novel forms that are born from digital media. So in this last week, we looked at music. We looked at how music was changed by digital media, by becoming digital. And this week, we're looking at how text is changed and reconstituted, reformatted literally by becoming digital. So, just as a reminder about the assessment, these, I think some of you have asked, and I told you, and this stuff is on the VLE, but just as a reminder, for those of you who haven't clocked this yet, you have 2 weeks to answer 2 essay titles. So you have a set of 10 essay titles to be released on the 10th of February, and so that's well after the module's finished, and you'll have a chance to revise over the break. And you'll get these. You get a list of 10 questions. You choose 2 of the questions, and you write 2 brilliant essays in response to them. Okay, that's all you have to do within 2 weeks. You should also look at the timings of your other assessments just to balance them out. But just have a look and see think about scheduling time, making time available for doing this work. I would suggest doing it over a lot of the work over the straight away, as soon as you get the titles to start immediately rather than leaving it for 2 weeks. So you get a chance to revise and rework what it is that you're doing. Okay, does anyone have any questions about that, or just as a kind of information thing? Something to look forward to, huh? Okay. So, in the first lecture, we talked about the digital meaning and distinction between the discrete and the continuous, that is, the separate and the continuous. In a sense, we can say that digital media changes our understanding of what culture is made up of, that it's made up of lots and lots of little bits that are joined together in different ways. And this kind of joining together is what constitutes the specific aesthetic of digital media. So different kinds of cultural form, music, text, so on, are changed by the way that they are able to be described by this grammar of lots and lots of little bits, or by the way in which they push back against it and revise what this atomistic approach is. So one of the approaches to digital media is to think of it as part of a longer current of the way, part of a longer historical current in relationship to this disjunction or this combination of the discrete and the continuous. One of the things that digital media does, in a sense, is to bring different versions of the discrete and continuous together into a unified platform. But prior versions can be seen throughout, and these are examples from the 20th century, but it could be earlier ones, and some of those are shown this lecture. Prior examples would be Bertrand Russell's logical atomism. So this is an argument from philosophy and the development of a particular sub-branch of philosophy, analytical philosophy, that tries to break down statements into their most basic components. A lot of this work in logical descriptions of statements feeds in later into the birth of computing. We remember back to lecture 1, Turing's description of the algorithmic machine that is able to produce a simulation or a model of someone solving a mathematical problem. Frederick Taylor, many of you are probably familiar with this idea of scientific management, the idea that you can look at a workflow and break it down into logical subcomponents, so it's smaller and smaller fragments of a flow of work. You know, if you think of the classic idea of the 20th century production line, the factory production line, Fordist production, as it's called by Antonio Gramsci. Frederick Taylor was a proponent, amongst many others, but one of the leading proponents of what was called scientific management, the idea that you could break down a human activity or a productive activity into lots and lots of smaller parts that could then be each rationalized and made more efficient. Digital media, in a sense, takes part in this breaking down into smaller and smaller parts. And a third example, and there could be many others, would be Noam Chomsky's idea of generative grammar, the idea that language is something embedded in the human nervous system, or the human brain, is native to us as a species, but it consists of a series of very simple neurological units that are embedded in the brain, out of which we construct linguistic statements, out of which we are innately able to speak and predisposed towards language, but that treats language as a set of small building blocks, out of which complex structures can be built. So if you think of Lego, for instance, as a form of cultural atomism, Lego as a small set of building blocks out of which complex structures can be built. This is, in a sense, Chomsky's idea of generative grammar. The argument for how this applies to digital media is complex in a sense, but it's about a description of the world as consisting of lots and lots of small elements, whether they be abstracted as ons and offs in a circuit, ones and zeros at a high level of description, or small clusters of characters in assembly code, or more complex clusters of characters in a higher level computing language, or as a digital product such as a PowerPoint slide. Okay, so thinking about text and language and the relationship between text and language, how language is broken down into this relationship between the discrete and the continuous. This is something also that occurs across the 20th century and earlier, but particularly occurs at the beginning of the 20th century as a relationship to language, understanding language as something that is almost like a machine that we all take part in. So understanding text, understanding language as having this kind of machinic quality. The machine composed by grammar, as much as it's composed by individual words or sentiments, is something that was proposed most forcefully by Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Has anyone heard this name? Okay, so this is a kind of key figure in 20th century linguistics, and in many cases seen as the father of structuralism. So what he proposed was to understand language as something that doesn't necessarily convey meaning in and of itself, and that you don't say exactly what you mean, but you only say what you mean in relationship to the words that are available to describe what it is that you want to say. so that your inner feeling isn't exactly translated into exactly what comes out of your mouth or exactly what you write. You negotiate your what it is that you want to say in relationship to what is possible to say. And language is that thing that is this machine for expressing possible statements that we all inhabit and we all contribute to. So the language of 1905 is very different to the language of 2019. There's a highly different set of vocabulary that's available. Things we can refer to now weren't available for people in that period to describe. So language is also dynamic. It's not something that's fixed. But as you can see here, there are two. His work is quite complex, but the two ordering principles that are kind of crystallize some of this argument. The idea of the syntagm, that is the order in which words can appear, and the paradigm. So there are these two forces that interact. The syntagm describes the way in which a sequence of words can happen, so that you couldn't have a completely random ordering of these words and be able to make sense within the language. So this ordering of words within something that's grammatically correct. And there's another principle that interacts with the syntagm, which is the paradigm. That is the kind of sense that you want to make. And so these two forces interact to produce a statement. And this machine for producing statements is something that we navigate when we're deciding what it is that we want to say. Yeah? And if you think of the space you're in when you're using autocorrect on your phone, in a sense, this is also the space that you're inhabiting as the text is produced by you, by the available vocabulary that you have in order to express what you want to say, and the phone's the particular dictionary, the particular grammatical structure that the phone is working with. Many phones, for instance, will use a piece of software called WordNet to guess what word it is that you want to say, and so on. So this space of navigating these possible statements, in this case a very kind of cliched sentence for the construction of grammar, or as an exercise statement for the construction of grammar. This space that we inhabit is the space of the machine of language, but it's also increasingly the space of software agents that are interacting with our use of language, perhaps sensing what it is that we want to say before we say it. So this understanding of language as a machine is something that has a long history. It's something that's first formalized in some 13th century texts, both Arabic texts and texts from this guy in particular, who was a Jesuit from Mallorca. And what this is a very simple set of machines for producing text. What we have here, and I won't go into explain in detail for reasons of time, each of these circles here, for instance, can be rotated in order to produce a new word. So this is a combinatorial approach to language. So each of these discs can be rotated to produce, to line up different texts. And what you have here is another kind of machine for producing statements. So if you think, or enunciations, or words, or texts, and we can say also that they're kinds of machine that produce not only individual statements, but produce a sense of the whole of language as a machine that we inhabit and that we work in. So Ramon Lull's work is kind of fundamental to this idea of language being a system and that language is not therefore something that is about individual expression or individual emotional feeling or individual precision. It's a larger space that we all inhabit and that we all work on. This space of language is then changed as text moves into, or language moves into print. So once, if we think back to the time in which text was, or language was something either spoken or written down by a small number of people, often in specifically religious organisations, but also that in Europe or in Asia, often connected to particular kinds of aristocratic social formations, such as courts. Once print enters the stage, suddenly language becomes available to many more people. So that the ability to read medical texts, scientific texts, religious texts suddenly becomes proliferated, and hundreds of books are available. If you were a monk in the medieval period, for instance, you may only see a very few books, 10, 20. If you were lucky, a very large library would have a few hundred volumes. And access to that was extremely controlled. Books were kept on chains within libraries. So once the printing press arises, language starts to proliferate, knowledge starts to spread in ways that are highly unpredictable. It's seen as very socially disruptive. These two books, the coming of the book and the printing press as an agent of social change, both kind of track this movement from the late medieval period to what became the Renaissance and the birth of humanism. As I've said in the first lecture, the birth of humanism with the age of print and the age of the book created a specific intellectual culture around the generality of knowledge, the democratic access to knowledge, the ability to contest and revise knowledge. So as the culture of the book is replaced or supplemented by the culture of the computer, we have different kinds of questions of what constitutes knowledge. The whole argument around so-called fake news, the whole argument around circulation of information that may or may not be useful, valuable, healthy, etc., is also part of this debate. In a sense, you can see that many of the same arguments that have had around the internet and circulation of non-information also happens in the Renaissance period. So there were many different cultures of publishing that emerged at that time. So these kind of historical tendencies are something to look out for as we kind of experience the present. So one of the key terms to think about, as well as this way in which we can think of language as a machine from Saussure, and we think about language as a media system from Eisenstein and Febvre and Martin, is the idea of discourse. So this is, as well as the specific grammatical structures and affordances of the syntagm and paradigm as they interact. Another term to bear in mind is this idea of discourse, that is the idea of what is possible to say at any given historical moment. I want to say this is related, perhaps, to Saussure's idea of the paradigm, in that the paradigm describes the context in which you're speaking and makes certain kinds of statements understandable. So something can be understandable within the paradigm of speaking between people who are friends compared to speaking between people who don't know each other. So different social contexts, for instance, or a scientific paper will have a difference in paradigm to teenagers chatting on while they're playing Fortnite or something. So different things will be paradigmatically sensible or adequate, depending on the context. So Foucault develops this argument, and he thinks about what goes into composing the paradigm, in a sense. Looks at institutions, looks at forms of practice, so things people do, as well as simply linguistic operators within that. So it looks at the whole states of mind, whole cultural formations as producing and contributing to and shaping this machine. So the discourse becomes part of the structure that conditions what it is possible to say, what it is possible to imagine, what kinds of forces go into constituting what it is that ends up as text. So with the production of text, however, you also have something. The discourse is not simply something that acts on language, acts on text, but is also shaped by things that people write down, things that people record, new forms of producing an idea, of producing memory, of producing archives that allow for new forms of idea to spread, to be recorded, to be shared, to be distributed, and so on. And so thinking about the way in which a discourse emerges and reconstitutes what it's possible to say as it produces new kinds of object and subject of study. For instance, in Foucault's work, the idea of madness, for instance, in The Birth of the Clinic, the idea that madness is something that what is understood to be mad changes over time and is produced in different ways by different kinds of institutions, different kinds of scientific practice, different kinds of discourse. This is also something that changes historically. So, what we see as being mad in the present is different to what was seen several centuries ago, and certainly in the 19th century, with the kind of formal description of madness emerges. So, just as for madness, so also for language, so also for text, the idea of what constitutes a part of language changes as history is made and as time passes. So what we're looking at is something that moves from Saussure's relatively static description of language as the interaction of the syntagm and the paradigm to something that is much more, has many more dimensions, institutional, historical, epistemic, and so on, and changes over time. That is, it's dynamic. Yeah? So if we have this understanding of language as something that is multidimensional, it's complex, and is historically formed, and which we are able to form as we take part in it, we also have to think in the present about how language is shaped by new kinds of actors that are computers, programming languages, digital formats, and so on. So one of the people that's tried to think about this is a German media theorist, Friedrich Kittler. And he develops Foucault's idea to integrate a discussion of technologies. So how do technologies shape our understanding of language? How do they shape what it's possible to say, what it's possible to feel, and so on? And he uses this term discourse networks, so adds another word. As you can see, it's syntagmatically possible to add another word to the word discourse. And his definition is all the technologies and institutions that allow a given culture to select, store, and produce the relevant data. So in a way, it's kind of both an expansion of the notion of discourse, because he's adding technologies, but he's making a description that is also reductive in some way. So this work of the technologies is to select, to store, and to produce the relevant data. One could say in the present that not only is a media system something that selects, stores, and produces data, but it's something that also analyzes data. So in the way that computers now extract data from people or willing volunteers for data extraction, computers also analyze data. In this book, Discourse Networks 1800 to 1900, he's looking specifically about how text in the form of the typewriter, which is introduced in that century, and the idea of the novel, which is also a form that emerges and massifies in that period, change the way people feel. Has anyone read Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther? No? So this is one of the case studies he looks at. So this is what's called an epistolary novel. It's a novel about a kind of tragic love affair between two young people, and it was a massive sensation at the time. If you think of like Harry Potter or some other kind of best-selling novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther was even more powerful because it was one of the first novels of its kind. So it's one of the first novels to become a massive bestseller. So this in itself was a cultural phenomenon, that a novel became something that many people across a whole continent read. And it also entailed a changing in people's emotional habits. One of the things that Kittler tracks is the way in which, because of this novel, the particular vocabulary that this novel used, people began to see their own love affairs as being similar and started to describe their feelings in this new way. So, as with the Foucauldian position, that discourse allows for novel kinds of practices and new kinds of norms to emerge. The idea of romantic love in a particular way was also, in Kittler's argument, established by this new media system of the novel. This was because there was, on the one hand, the novel allowed for the kind of mass production of books, so hundreds of thousands or millions of exemplars of a particular novel. And the mode of consumption of the novel was highly individual. So people read the novel individually and internalize the characters, the state of the characters as they read it. So this is part of the specific habit of the media system or the discourse network of the novel. So there's this mix of the personal, the highly individual, and the mass machine. You can see immediately that there's a correlation with social media, for instance, in the present. And so this mixture of a mass production of a particular cultural form and this individuation of sentiment, this use of a grammar of feeling, this use of a grammar of understanding of what a person might feel as being immediately relatable to the questions of social media. So if we think of this technology and how it emerges, in order to produce, so to give a kind of back history to digital text, we think about the histories of printing and of type. It's something that emerges in China much earlier than in Europe. First of all, kind of carving by the technique called block printing, which are carved wooden blocks or sometimes ceramic blocks by the 11th century that would be painted with ink and then pressed onto paper. In the 14th century, you have, but these were solid blocks, so you'd have a page that may be text, it may be an image, maybe both, a combination of text and image, that will be printed in relatively large numbers, but they'll be printed as one solid image of a page. The big innovation that kind of exemplified the relationship between the discrete and the continuous was in the 11th century with the first movable type made of clay. A contemporary movable type doesn't really exist, but up until the kind of end of the 20th century, movable type was made of metal. But clay was introduced in China to allow for much more modular composition. So each element of a printed page could be reused with movable type. So each ideogram, each word would be a specific block that could be mixed together with other blocks to make a syntagmatically correct statement. In the 15th century, you have the introduction of the press, so something that would allow for these pages of movable type to be produced on a much more massive scale. So the press would be something like a wine press or a cider press, oil press, that would press the page down with very equal force to allow the impression of ink on the page. If we think of the introduction, and this was a German invention, Gutenberg, the introduction of the printing press into the UK was someone who was an apprentice of Gutenberg, William Caxton, and in this kind of Brexit era where we think about Britain's relationship to Europe, we think of this supposedly national hero, William Caxton. The knowledge he got was through Cologne and Bruges, so this knowledge exchange was inherently international in this period. By the 19th century, you have the introduction of the typewriter, which we say again is a precursor of digital technology. Each symbol is present in uppercase and lowercase forms on each of these levers, which are moved, actuated by depressing keys. And then you have also a very high technology, the telegraph. So think of the way in which digital media is not simply digital media, otherwise it might simply just be the typewriter. It's also digital, networked, and computational media. So the telegraph was a way of taking discrete characters, turning them into electric pulses, so electric rather than electronic pulses, and sending them over networks, so via radio waves and by wire. Each of those transformations into wire and into radio waves requires a form of translation. But this kind of apparatus for turning text into something that could be distributed across time and space with great rapidity was one of the kind of major achievements of the 19th century. So if you think of this movement of language from something that is passed person to person through the printing press, through movable print, through movable type, through to the typewriter, and then through to something that is encoded in electromagnetic pulses, you have the basis for what becomes digital media. And so this is what we know as digital media, or we're calling in this lecture electronic text. So this sense of language as being something natural, as being something in which we merely express ourselves, in a sense, by all of these different technologies, is something that is, in a sense, one could say, okay, it's not true, that we merely carry out a function of the machine, or that we say, actually, ourselves is something that is interwoven into the nature of the machine, and there is no absolute distinction between these two categories. And so there's this debate that goes on when people talk about digital media often, are we, by entering into this kind of structural relationship with these machining forces, and the way in which we take language to be an expression of our true selves, and our honest or sincere or deeply felt feeling? Is it something in which we're betrayed by language, or is language always machinic, always technological, and has it inherently got a part in shaping what it is that we say? You know, so this is part of the debate we see at present within debates of social media, or debates around the effect of digital technology on social formations. Okay. One other invention I wanted to kind of quickly show you is this coupling of the telegram with other forms of organisation of knowledge in print. So this is an example of, well, it's an institute called the Mundanium. Has anyone heard of this? Okay, so if you think of the World Wide Web, and you think specifically of things such as Wikipedia, the idea that you can have a global encyclopedia that contains useful and roughly objective information. This is an example of a social institution that attempted to do roughly the same thing, but by telegram. So this was from the end of the 19th century to about 1930. This was a functioning institution that ran in Brussels and had a kind of an institute. A part of the institute was also in a regional Belgian town called Mons. There's a museum in Mons that you can visit that has a massive collection of the apparatus from this space. But this was effectively like a 19th and early 20th century version of a data center, like a server farm. You had this room here was the telegram room, where you'd have, I think, around 100 telegram machines. If you had a question about what was the state of art of research into a certain scientific matter, or what were the bibliographic references gathered across the world for a certain kind of building material, for instance, you would send a telegram into the Mundanium, and you would get a telegram back telling you where to look for certain information. Yeah, so it's very much. So the telegram would be received here. It would go to these people working here. You see them mainly women who would do the work on these index cards. So tens of thousands of index cards, hundreds of thousands of index cards that will contain the information that was needed, or references to information. So the telegram in would be a request for information on the topic, and the telegraph out would be references to information that would give you the most up-to-date information on any matter. Here, there's a desk that allows for work on this in this space. So you imagine many of these desks were put in different institutions across the world. Part of the emphasis of the Mundanium was that it was post-First World War, particularly in the 1920s, this project really took off, but also kind of collapsed within a few years. The idea that following the First World War, there was a need for development of a global knowledge infrastructure that would allow for collaboration, that would preempt possibilities of conflict, and would give people the capacity to share intellectual and knowledge resources more fully. So there was a working table here that has all the equipment and resources necessary to pose a question to the Mundanium system, and here we have a diagram of the relationship between individual pieces of knowledge and how they build up to the wider knowledge infrastructure within the system. So if we think of the Mundanium as something that proposes an infrastructure for information that's inherently networked but is flawed by being in some way centralized, we can see it as articulating and setting up, constituting some of the kinds of questions around clarity, of access to information, of circulation of information that are found very widely in discussions of the World Wide Web or the Internet more broadly. So if you're interested in the kind of history of information structures, this is something that's worth following up. Someone who took this idea in a certain way and thought about the way in which the idea of information systems also has consequences for the way we think was the Argentinian writer Borges. This book is translated into English as fictions, and part of the book is a series of stories about fantastic information systems. So, for instance, a society that consists entirely of a library. Has anyone read Borges? Okay. So he's a kind of mid to late 20th century writer who produces kind of fantasies of information systems. And one of these, as I said, is a society that consists entirely of a library. No one knows he built the library. The library consists of an infinite number of books which contain every possible sequence of characters, every possible sequence of statements. And the work of the society is to wander around amidst the library stacks and try and find books that make some kind of sense, even for a few pages or for a few sequences of characters. So in a sense, Borges preempts much of the discussion of digital media and the relationship we have to text, in that he suggests that once it's possible to produce machines that can produce in a combinatorial fashion, if we think back to the idea of Chomsky, for instance, his idea that the human brain consists of a module or the human brain contains a module that allows for the production of every possible statement. What Borges does is say, okay, imagine that every possible statement had been written down and turned into a book. Most of those statements would be nonsensical. They would consist of strings of random characters, and occasionally you might chance upon a book that contains a sensible phrase or a phrase that related to language. So what he does is, in a sense, if we think back to Ramon Lull's idea of machines that produce combinations of letters, combinations of statements, Borges encourages us to think in a kind of science fictional or fantasy way about what it is, what the nature of language is in a machinic state. So once machines enter into language and allow for any possible statement to be produced as a technical device, and that the institutions exist to produce those statements, such as a library, such as a society that is nothing but a library, what effect does that have on knowledge? If it's possible to produce any possible sequence of characters through mechanical means, and our job as humans is to kind of sift through these possible sets of infinite combinations, or nearly infinite combinations, what does this mean for the culture of text? So part of the aesthetic question that is posed by digital text or electronic text is this relationship between the possible or the abstractly possible and the concrete, the specific text that we're looking at. How does each text negotiate the space of all possible texts? So, in the seminar, we'll look at the first book by Dennis Tenen, the author, plain text. And here, in his second book, The Author Function, he produces another genealogy to this, which is the idea of different kinds of... Is this visible to you? I realise it's a bit dense. Different kinds of prehistories of machining text. So the idea of basic forms of statement that are possible to make. For instance, in Vladimir Prop's book, Morphology of the Folktale, this is a Russian formalist text which looks at the basic elements of the folktale or the fairy tale and breaks it down into a series of... his argument is that there are only a small number of basic stories, and that each version of the folktale just plays with these basic modular units. Yeah? So in a sense, it's similar to this idea of Saussure, but it does it at the level of, not at the level of the individual word or the individual letter, but at the level of the elements in the story. Yeah? So the Prop's idea is that the elements of the story are themselves like Lego pieces and can be recombined to produce different kinds of outcome. What Tenen does in his book is to look not only at this kind of formalism that arises from fundamental research into language and into culture, but he also says that there is an equivalent to Frederick Taylor's scientific management in the production of text in the 20th century, and he looks at manuals for the production of text by writers. So he maps the history of how-to guides for writing and shows that the technique of writing that we see as often governed by expertise or inspiration, or the idea of writing as something that is unique to an individual author, is something that people also work at through systematic and programmatic techniques for text construction. So prior to the computer's ability to produce text, we have basically programmatic or algorithmic text being produced by human writers who would then sell these often as detective stories, romance novels, genre fiction, more generally. Yeah? So there are some writers in the 20th century who, for instance, ran, and the late 19th century, who ran basically a studio system of writers. For instance, Balzac, Human Comedy, one of the great realist writing projects of the late 19th century, consisted of Balzac writing the outlines of these novels, and then a team or studio of writers who were under him writing specific elements of them. There's an American pulp fiction writer whose name appears on several thousand novels because they ran a studio system where components of the story would be put together as in a production line, a car production line. So this system runs through the 20th century and feeds into the kinds of programmatic text we begin to see now. Here are a sequence of patents for the production of different kinds of text, from poetry to technical texts. Ezra Pound, the modernist early 20th century poet, comments on this problem, this phenomenon, and sees these books that describe how to write, the machines for writing, as the maximum possible intellectual degradation. And so there's this status of the human that is having an innate capacity for expression that figures like Pound see as inherently degrading, as devaluing the human. Then the question is, okay, what is this human that Pound is seeking to, this mode of inspiration that Pound is seeking to place on a higher level of value? So there's always this tension that arises in the relationship of the collective and machinic aspect of language as it plays out against this figure of poetic inspiration, that Pound very strongly represents. This tendency also plays out a lot in the literature of the 20th century, specifically avant-garde literature. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you have fragmentary text or collage text that is produced by the application of rules for the production of randomization into text. You have groups such as the Brazilian anthropophagia movement that work with modernist fragmentary impulses in parallel to surrealism, to try and break out of the colonial imperatives of the language that they were working with. So for them, Spanish, Portuguese rather. They were particularly interested in breaking the nature of Portuguese as a colonial language as they saw it. So the idea of bringing modernist traditions in literature, or modernist currents in literature, in relationship to an anti-colonial struggle was how they inhabited language, and they wanted to find new forms of machining language that broke with the conventions of language. As you move through the 20th century, you have more procedural means for producing linguistic processes or linguistic statements. The cut-up novels of William Burroughs, anyone familiar with these? Yeah. Does anyone read books? No one does. They're kind of cute. It's like using horses for transport, I guess. But the idea that language itself was this machine, and you could get access to it by literally taking a pair of scissors to text and reorganizing language. Algorithmic writing, the Workshop for Potential Literature, Oulipo, using some of the first people to use procedural means or computational means to produce text. And in both appropriation and conceptual writing, the idea that language is something that, in this kind of wider framing of discourse, one of the things that an artist or a writer can do is to take language and rewrite it. So many of the kind of the feminist writers of the late 20th century, one of their activities would be to steal what they saw as the language of patriarchy and rework it, to break it open, to smash the machine, and reorganize it along new lines. So this question of how language relates to discourse in a programmatic sense is key. I'll skip this because we're running a bit late. This is a screenshot from a very early demo from 1967 of what became known as hypertext. So on the one hand you have here, this is a very low resolution, sorry, it's a shopping list. Here this guy, Douglas Engelbart, who's one of the inventors of hypertext, shows how a computer, this is one of the first demos of a computer producing hypertext, producing editable copy and paste, cut and paste text. If you have time, I'd really recommend going onto YouTube and having a look at this demo. So it's a project from Stanford Research Institute in 1967, and it pretty much lays out most of the mechanics of electronic text and programmatic text that unfolded over the last third of the 20th century. So you'll see features there that are deeply familiar to you, and you'll see many features that have not yet been incorporated into our daily computers. But here we can see this is in a sense one of the kind of crystallizing moments that changes what the nature of text is into hypertext. But it's also a moment where programming languages become formalized. So many of you will be familiar with languages such as Python, to a certain extent HTML, and so on. Programming languages themselves have a history, and there are many hundreds of programming languages. Some of them are written for very specific purposes. So some of them are written for more mathematical purposes, some of them are written for more business purposes, some of them are written for very low-level relationship to the hardware, some of them are written in a way that emphasizes address to the human. And each of them have different benefits and different kinds of functionality. Some of them are written specifically, such as Perl or Python, are written particularly for engagement with text as a medium. So text itself has something that has particular qualities to it that change the way in which a computer addresses it. Another aspect of electronic text is the aspect of control, comparison, analysis. Has anyone used Turnitin? Yes. You may not read novels, but you love Turnitin. It's a great part of your life. But this is what Turnitin looks like to someone who's marking your essay. Yeah, if we think, okay, this smells a bit fishy, it's kind of unskillfully plagiarized. This is what we look at. And this shows us supposedly the correlations that or equivalences your text has with the work of some other scholars. So here, text becomes, as part of this wider linguistic machine, text becomes highly analytical and comparative. We're able to cross-reference millions of texts in order to evaluate where they sit in relationship to other texts. And quite often what you find is that because of this syntagmatic and paradigmatic quality that Saussure mapped, that the correlations, every text has something in common with many other texts. It's almost impossible to write a completely unique text. So this set of correlations between your text and someone else's text is always present. There's no one who writes a completely original text, and if they did, it would probably be in a language that doesn't yet exist. Or it'd be like something from Borges's library. So when you're thinking about this act of writing, you're always writing in a space that is thickly and densely packed with other texts. And what Turnitin does and what other computational systems do is allow for these kind of correlations and correspondences and equivalences, and sometimes 100% equivalences, unfortunately, allow them to be compared and to be mapped. Another thing that we'll quickly look at is bots, so machines that are written in programming languages that produce text. Some of you will be familiar with these as Twitter streams. If you're interested in producing a very simple Twitter bot, then this website, Cheap Bots Done Quick, is a very good way of doing it. It takes a couple of hours to set up a Twitter account and mix statements from different kinds of sources in order to produce a bot that produces something that is language-like but not necessarily fully meaningful. But these bots are also something that now start to act as actors within computer networks. So this is a screenshot from a bot that was produced by American Express to interact with customers 3 years ago. Many of you will be familiar with call centres. I guess one of the key forms of contemporary literature is the call centre. If you think about when you call into a call centre, you interact with someone who's reading from a script. Essentially, what these kinds of products do is to remove the interrelation between the person who is reading the script at you and just gives you direct access to the interaction with the script. So increasingly, we'll see all of those jobs, such as call centres, that were supposed to replace industrial jobs at the factory, as the language machine becomes the space of kind of corporate structuration. We also see these kinds of jobs being replaced by bots. And these bots then also become active players within financial systems. Yeah, so if we think of machines of language that are produced both by normal kind of natural language acts, but also by programmatic and formal languages, these machines that start off in the Middle Ages before the Middle Ages with print, with combinatorial text, moving through to programmatic text, now start to act independently of human control. And so this kind of genealogy of digital text that relies on the way in which text is inherently combinatorial, inherently programmatic, whether we interpret it as paradigmatic or syntagmatic, or through discourse, or through algorithmic processes, or through kind of avant-garde textual practices, these all kind of converge on this present state in which language operators begin to act on value, the way value is arranged in a society through the very simple mechanism, and many would say kind of overly simple mechanism of the value of a stock or a share or an option or a bond and so on. So the way in which these kinds of statements of the value of a company, the value of or the work that a company does, that is able to be reduced to a simple line of numbers, are also things that are able to be acted on by linguistic operators such as share trading bots. Okay, and I think that kind of sums up the status of language in the electronic space for now. So seminars, where if we, has Lewis sent the seminar groups around? Okay, so if the first group go on the ground floor in Wilmington Tower, the second group go to 13 Loring Grove.